This week on The Grit Crusade.
Well, how do we ever go into our future if we're not, we are always informed by our past.
Yeah.
But if we're misinformed by our past because we haven't taken the time to deal with it, then how do we ever step into our future? And
Hey, Grit Crusaders. I am Brooke Plack, your co-host here today on the Grit Crusade podcast. If it's your first time joining us, welcome to the channel and welcome to the podcast. Sometimes I have guests, sometimes I'm by myself, and as in today, sometimes I have a co-host.
Woohoo!
Yay.
Yeah.
My best friend, Dani Hardy, is here. We have been friends since we were 8 years old.
long time.
I know. And we are in the middle of a mini-series called Navigating. Right? And the first one was Navigating Hard Seasons, which we'll link in the show notes for you. The second one was Navigating Motherhood.
Yeah.
Ain't no hood like the motherhood. And this episode today is about navigating grief.
Yeah.
So Dani and I have both been through seasons of grief in our life. I have been through grief recovery and spent a lot of time in therapy and working through those hard seasons of grief. And so today we're going to dive into those and kind of talk about how those show up in our life and what we can do when that happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm glad to
all
be
right.
here.
Yeah,
this
me
is
too.
not, I said earlier, I was like, I feel like maybe I should listen to something somber before we start this session, right? Like a procession of some sort. But I mean, here we are.
Well, funeral music kind of sucks anyway, so I feel like that when I die, y'all better not play something crazy.
We'll
like
play
sad,
something great.
something like upbeat or
Do you
like
have that written
hood.
down somewhere? I feel like
no, but I want a leopard casket.
that'll be an easy find.
Yes, so y'all can't bury me till I have one. So here's the deal. So since we're talking about grief, which has to do with loss,
We just jumped
yeah,
right
we did
into the casket.
And
That was-
grief is not all about death, and I'm
Right.
going to talk about that today for sure. But first, I want to talk about my leopard casket. So my husband and I have a thing. So the first one of us to die is going to get cremated. Okay.
Okay.
Then the other one, the second one that dies, is going to be buried like with their urn and ashes, so that we're buried together. It's
Yeah.
something we decided to do. And we don't really care what anyone else thinks.
Yeah.
But here's the caveat. He is not getting off cheap just buying some urn and putting me in it. Like, you're going to have to either buy or rent. I don't care. You can rent it. I won't know. A leopard casket, and I'm having the whole funeral thing, and then you can put me in the burner.
Okay. Okay, because I was imagining if you went first and we put you in the urn, then
No,
we
no,
had to bury Justin in a
leopard
leopard casket.
casket? No.
That was going to get
So,
weird.
like, I just need the casket for the, like, just for the
funeral.
Yeah, the funeral. I was going to say ceremony, but funeral. Yeah, so, like, it could be like a rentacasket.com or something. Like, I don't really care because I don't need the vault. All I need is just the leopard casket, so it looks fabulous up there, and then you can put me in the incinerator.
I can't
Sweep up the ashes.
decide if I'm proud of you or appalled at the amount of time you've thought about just the casket. Like, I think I'm proud of you, but
Yeah.
it feels kind of weird.
Yeah, does it? I think once you've been through really hard seasons of grief, like, stuff doesn't bother you
Sure.
anymore, right? And I
Sure.
think one day we just decided to, like, figure it out because we're like, what are we going to do? You
Yeah.
know, because, like, we've been through death and loss and, like, since we've been married, as you
Right.
guys have as well.
Right.
And so, like, I don't know why. I was like, what are we going to do? But we also haven't decided where we're going to be buried. So anyway, even though this episode's not about caskets or leopard print, that was the lead-in for today. That was our lead-in to
There you
grief.
go.
So yeah.
And it wasn't even pre-planned.
It
was
wasn't.
just like
It just
jumping
happened.
in.
That's kind of how I roll with it on these podcasts.
love it.
I'm like a get real girl. Just
Yeah.
kind of my train of thought sometimes is all over the place, but I feel like usually it comes back to, like, it's kind of like a roundabout. You know those things you hate to drive on, and then all the spurs, but eventually you get back to where you were supposed to be going.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know. That's how we've navigated conversation since I first met you.
I know,
Back in
right?
third grade.
Corn dogs. That's our best memory. I don't think
Aw.
should we tell? I think we told that in our previous episode.
did.
I'll link it in the show notes too.
You should go back and listen to the
Yeah.
corn dog. We had corn dog trivia that day.
We did. Oh, we did. That's right.
Corn dog festival.
Yeah, that was good. So, all right. So let's talk about grief. That's what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah.
So something I learned in grief recovery, which there is a book, a grief handbook, that's a little purple book that we will link in the show notes. So Rebecca is my executive assistant that's behind the camera that's helping us produce these episodes. So when I say link in the show notes, then that's her cue to write the notes down to help me remember what to link in the show notes. So if I forget something, feel free to comment and we'll be sure and add it. But so I never knew that grief wasn't just death. And so in going through grief therapy, I learned that, like, for example, for me, I lost my mom to suicide in 2013. For someone else, losing their job could be just as traumatic.
Right.
And there is no, like, something is worse.
Mm-hmm.
So the loss is just as real to the person. It could be a pet.
Right.
It could be a prized ring. Like I'm wearing one of my mom's rings today.
Yeah.
It could be a jewelry. It could be any loss that someone's experiencing. And I was like, what?
Mm-hmm.
I just thought grief was death.
Right. No, it's absolutely not. And I'm so glad you said that, because I think there are times, so I'm a women's pastor, and there are times that I'm pastoring someone or meeting with them and having a conversation, and I listen to them talk, and then I speak back to them. Here's what I hear you saying.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times where I will point out to someone, I hear a lot of grief in what you're sharing right now. And their immediate response is like, oh, no. Like, I'm not grieving. Nobody died. I'm like, grief is so much more than death. Grief is loss.
It is.
And it can be loss of all different kinds of things. I know for me, one of the hardest things I've ever grieved, and it wasn't a death, but it was a loss, was the loss of my career. And so I went to college to be an educator. I taught kindergarten for 8 years, and I stopped teaching to stay at home and raise our oldest. And then I got to stay at home with her for a couple of years, and then I stepped into ministry. And though there was great joy in that season, grieving my career as an educator has been a perpetual grief, because I had to grieve just releasing that job, because I chose to step back from that career and releasing it. But then every time a school year starts, that grief of like, oh,
setting up your classroom.
right, like part of me wants to do that. Like I long for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the grief of letting my teaching certificate lapse, like letting it go and going,
I remember when I got that
okay,
email, like,
right?
it's time to renew, and I
Yeah.
hadn't done my hours because I wasn't teaching anymore.
yeah.
And yeah.
And so it's that grief, and this for me it was career that has crept up over and over again. But it can be that for a multitude of conditions, like circumstances. But when grief resurfaces because of circumstances of our life, and we go, oh, like I remember that pain, I remember that loss,
Yeah.
and then it's an invitation to re-grieve, whether it's momentarily or for a longer period of time. What we once grieved in full, we are allowed to grieve in part as we continue to live our lives.
Yeah.
And that's like with the death of someone that we love, the loss of someone we love through death, that we grieve first. We grieve our first birthday without them, or our first Christmas without them. We have those moments where we grieved their death when it happened, but then we're invited to continually grieve the loss of that person's presence in our life as we encounter new circumstances.
Isn't it strange, though? I shouldn't say strange, maybe unique. It's probably a better word to say, though, that, for example, some people, the death of a loved one, when their birthday comes around, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
I have no emotion when my mom's birthday comes.
Yeah.
None. And it's very unique how it's different for different people. And I think that is something, one of the biggest things I learned about grief is that there is no one right way
Correct.
to grieve.
Right.
And it's very individual.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay.
Yeah, because it is okay, because especially if it's with a person, all of our relationships are unique and distinct. And so to imagine that we would all grieve in some cookie cutter manner when our relationships are so different, when we're all so different, we're unique and one of a kind individuals. And so, of course, the way that we process loss is unique and distinct, whether it's a loss of a job, the loss of a friendship. I mean, I think about the friendships that I've lost of people who are very much still alive. And I might still have a relationship with those people, but the relationship has changed, and there's grief in that. And they're like, so often when you help someone understand where they are and they don't even know they're grieving, and you say, you're grieving the loss of a relationship, the loss of what it was, and having to accept what it presently is, and needing to have curiosity about what it one day will be. But that's a grief process, and learning how to set aside our expectations of how we think we're supposed to grieve, right? Like air quotes, supposed to grieve, and allowing ourselves to process it as it comes to us individually, I think is a huge part of getting to that place of acceptance in those stages of grief.
I agree with that. I think that, during the pandemic, I lost 3 friendships abruptly during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And we talked about this in our episode about hard seasons, though, is I feel like that prepared me for later abrupt losses of friendships and relationships.
Yeah.
And so there is some growth that comes out of it.
Yeah.
And you definitely learn more about yourself, but it's something you can't rush.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's the hard part about it. You
Sure.
can't hurry grief.
So for someone, I'm asking you this. So for someone who is futuristic, who is looking ahead and has a more challenging time staying present to a moment because you're thinking ahead, whether it be about things that need to be done or visions you have for the future or ideas that you have for the future, allowing yourself the space, the actual margin of space and time and emotional energy to grieve something. How do you do that? What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So for me, I didn't first, you know. So then I spent time in grief recovery and therapy, having to unpack it later, you know, which we kind of talked about in the first episode about hard seasons. And so now, being the person that is on the side of realizing, you know, I didn't handle that the best way. Knowing that you've got to express your emotions, and what that looks like could be different. Sure. It could be journaling to yourself. It could be writing letters to the person that lost, which was part of my grief recovery, was writing letters to, and I had to, when I went through grief recovery, I had to like identify a list of all the people I needed to grieve. Ones that were still living, ex-husbands, ex-in-laws, ex-friends, you know, ex-boyfriends, whatever it was. And these aren't necessarily letters that you're going to send to people. And probably wouldn't. You know, but
important note.
But so processing the emotions and expressing them in some way, and maybe it's you sitting in front of a camera and talking it out, or maybe you do have a trusted person or a therapist that you could talk to about it. But knowing that you have to take that time to process it, because it's always harder to experience the feelings later, in my experience. You know what I mean? But it is hard because I don't like to reflect on the past all the time. I feel like that some people live there, and I'm like, I just don't think it's healthy. But I think you do have to realize that there is something to be gained from that season too. You know?
Well, how do we ever go into our future if we're not? We are always informed by our past. But if we're misinformed by our past because we haven't taken the time to deal with it, then how do we ever step into our future, into the fullness that we're intended to? Like, I don't think it's possible.
Well, and I think too, cherishing what was is also important, you know, and not just being like necessarily resentful. Like, for example, my brother-in-law died tragically in a work accident. Okay. My husband grieved that very differently than I did because it wasn't my sibling. Okay. Well, he was in recovery. He had previously been a fentanyl addict who had tackled those demons, made it through recovery, was engaged, he was working, he was about to graduate with his, you know, certificate for licensed electrician. And he gave me hope that addicts could recover. But because before him, I didn't believe in recovery. I did not believe in it. I thought it was a farce. I thought people were just going to do it until they were always going to relapse. I had no hope and no faith in addicts at all. I didn't have any. I'm not proud of that. I just didn't. And so I cherish what he taught me so much. Because without Tanner's story, I would be a different person than I am today. You know? But taking time to reflect and to really, you know, just realize how precious that is. Was healing for me in the loss of him, you know?
Absolutely. And I think about, I've had this written down just in my notes, the way that our stories impact other people, I think is a part of what you're sharing a little bit. And I remember the day I was headed to Fayetteville to go visit a friend who I love dearly and who she has taught me a lot about grief, which was so interesting because the day I was headed to go have lunch with Jen, I got the call from you about Tanner. And I remember this feeling of like, I need to turn around right now and go to Brooke. And I was already 2.5 hours away, you know? And I remember asking, like, do I need to come right now? And you were like, no, like, this is still going to be here tomorrow. This is still going to be here the next day. And when I showed up to lunch and I told Jen, I was like, this just happened and my heart is broken for this family. And like, and I'm sorry. Like, I apologized for like how I was showing up. And she said, no, like, we can have this conversation and your grief can sit right here. And she just kind of tapped the table. Like, it can sit right here with us. Like, it can be right here with us. It doesn't have to drive the day. It doesn't have to drive the conversation, but it's allowed to be here. And understanding that and just knowing who she has been in my life, and then the relationship that we had, and being able to say to that grief that I was having in large part on your behalf, because I didn't have a personal relationship with Tanner, but I have a very personal relationship with you, and a growing relationship with Justin, and a love of his family, that she was able to help me see the grief I was carrying and allowed me permission to show up with her so that I could better show up with you.
Yeah.
And then being able to come and show up with you time and time again. And so I think that impact that grief has on us isn't just to the person who's experiencing the immediate loss, but there's an extension of loss, right? And being able to carry the weight of our loss appropriately so that we can show up
that's good.
to the other people who our grief is impacting, or their grief is impacting us, because it defines how we show up. I mean, it's always hard to attend a funeral and you see people who are carrying the grief so differently, and we're all allowed to carry grief however we need to, whether it's, personal or relational, whatever. But to see someone walk up to the person of immediate loss, and the person who's experienced immediate loss, a parent, a sibling, a child, and they're kind of holding it together, and the person walking up who's like a second, fifth relative, fourth time removed, like, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And they're losing it on the person who it's an immediate loss for. That always grieves me, because I'm like, how we show up for the people who are experiencing immediate loss, how we show up for them matters exponentially. And I need to have safe places that I can process how I'm processing grief. Like, I needed the conversation to have that day with Jen, to process with her separate from processing with you.
Yeah, that's
so that
good.
when I showed up for you, I could process with you differently. And so I think that that's the story of, like, if we're experiencing relational loss, like you talked about friendship loss, or we're experiencing the loss of a career, the loss of a marriage, to be able, for me, because I love you. So every time you've experienced loss, I've experienced grief on your behalf.
Yeah.
But I need safe places to process what I'm experiencing, so that when I show up at your door, on your couch, wherever I show up with you and for you, I can show up as a gift to you and not as a grief to you.
That's good. That's really good, though. I had never really thought about it like that. I always, you're a little more the thoughtful of the friend, and I'm more like that. That is a hot mess. Like, what were they thinking, showing up and putting all that on him, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But, like, it's true, though. That's very true, because how we vent or process or whatever it is isn't always the same, depending on the person and how they're related to the event, you know? So
It's like if you lose your job and you come to me, right? And if all I can do is be ticked off with you about what you've just lost, then am I really helping you maneuver your way through the grief, or am I just fading the flame, right? And so if I can be ticked off on your behalf but process that with someone else, then I can be a better support system for you who's experiencing the immediate loss. And that's true of any kind of loss.
It is true. That is so true. So what do you think what do you think, like, in your opinion, are the things that get in the way of people processing grief?
I think the number one thing, and this is not going to be a popular opinion, but the number one thing from my vantage point is pride. Because there are times that I have witnessed people process their pain as a weakness. And that my tears are a weakness, or the fact that this hurts me so much is a weakness, or how long it's taking me to get through this is a weakness. Like, we have an expectation of ourselves, timeline. Right? Like, okay, I'm gonna give myself a week, or I'm gonna give myself this many days. How ludicrous that we should expect of ourselves to anticipate a timeline by which we should be done grieving something we've never experienced before. That's pride. That's saying, I'm in control of myself so much. I'm in control of my circumstances in my life so much that I can dictate how I'm going to feel in 5 days from now.
Wow, that's good.
Like, that's our pride. Instead of being humble enough to say, this is how I'm showing up in the world today. This is what I'm present to in this moment today. And I don't know what it's going to look like in 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, 2 years. I have no idea, because who am I to predict what the future is going to be, or to create a limitation on myself to dictate how I'll show up in the future? And so I think we get in our own way by creating expectation of what grief is supposed to look like, because we judged what it looked like with somebody else. And then we're holding ourselves to a standard when we're not living in someone else's skin or someone else's circumstances. And so we get in our own way of processing the feelings that we're called to show up to in a moment, because we're prideful about, can we do this as well as someone else did? Can I suffer as well as someone else did?
Man.
And I see it time and time and time again. Instead of having
like, she's handling it so much better than me.
Yes.
She lost her mom last year, and she's already XYZ, whatever that looks like.
Like, you have heard this narrative.
Yes. Yeah.
And it is a harsh and harmful narrative, because we're creating an expectation on ourselves of how we're supposed to somehow perform inside of our suffering. And suffering is not a performance. It is an invitation for us, right? And like I've said this in every episode, I attempt to live my life in Christ-likeness, to be conformed to the image of Christ. And Christ suffered. And Scripture says that if I suffer as Christ, then I can live as Christ. I can rejoice as Christ. And I want that. So I want to suffer well. But what it looks like for me to suffer well is different than what it looks like for you to suffer well. And as long as I'm suffering in a way that allows me to experience my own humanity, then I'm experiencing my own greater need and dependence on Christ. And for me, that's a gain and not a loss.
That's good. So the flip side of that, all right?
Yeah.
Is because I completely agree with you. Your wisdom is immense, and that it's evident that you've spent so much time with people suffering, right? There's where that wisdom comes from. Like, unfortunately, fortunately, you know?
Yeah.
But is the mindset of, well, shouldn't she have it together by now? You know? And we tend to pass that, we as humanity, not saying like we in this room,
right,
pass that on to other people of, well, her son died 2 years ago. I mean, come on now. You know what I mean? And that is so harsh. We impose
what we think their suffering should look like or not look like.
Yes.
Yes.
God.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself creates social limitation for those who are experiencing profound grief.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about, you know, someone who's just lost a career, or who's just lost a friendship, or who's just lost something that they see, no one died. And that's their sentiment towards themselves. Well, I need to get it together because nobody died here. Because we've only given ourselves permission as a culture and as a society to grieve death.
Yes.
And not to allow grief to be experienced through other kinds of losses. So we start with death and we end with death, but then we so diminish the experience inside of death where we say that they're supposed to be able to grieve, but get it together already. And so
life has to go on.
So we diminish the grief experience that we've allowed permission for, which then completely undercuts our ability to truly grieve anything else that is truly a loss.
Right.
Because if we're saying the person who's had a loss through death, and they're allowed to grieve, but not too much, then how do we ever truly grieve something that isn't death?
Yeah, that's good.
That makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Yeah. Like, I laid on my couch crying, like hysterically sobbing for like 18 straight hours when my Yorkie died, Josie.
Yeah.
Like I didn't lay on the couch and cry 18 straight hours when my mom committed suicide.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh my God, am I sadder that my dog died than my mom died? And then now you're judging yourself for how you should be grieving when there really is no way we should be grieving or not.
If there's a word, there are two words in the English language that I wish we would just do away with. Should and just.
I like them.
Because I think that whatever follows, should or just, are typically a diminishment of our experiences.
I love that.
And I'm over those words. I'm over them.
You know, I'm going to quit. I'm going to try the rest of the podcast not to say those words. Okay. All right. So I need a buzzer sound like if I say them. Okay.
Right. But we should all over ourselves.
Well, I talked about, it sounds like shit.
I know. But we do. I should do this. I shouldn't do this. I should.
I've talked about that in leadership on other podcasts of putting my should on other people. Like, they should. Who am I to should you?
No.
Like, I shouldn't tell you what you should be doing with your career.
Yeah.
You know, like people that work on my team or something. Well, they should have been the next general manager, department leader, the whatever.
Yeah.
What?
Right.
Who am I to put that on somebody?
Right.
You know, which is so true. All right. Speak a little bit about, for people listening. So I know it's always hard to hear stuff about, you know, it's hard to hear conversations on hard topics without knowing where people's pain comes from.
Sure.
You know, so talk a little bit about grief, some of the grief that you've experienced in your life. You don't have to like go super deep with it, but you know, like obviously I said, I've lost my mom to suicide.
Yeah.
I've lost my brother-in-law recently to a work accident. My Yorkie of 11 years who was with me through college and she was like my baby. She jumped off the front of the four-wheeler and busted her head open, and it was just horrific and traumatic.
But I want to stop here for just a second, because what you experienced with her was trauma and grief.
Yes.
And trauma is its own form of loss.
And when I started in grief recovery with a therapist, that this is like her jam, like her specialty. She was like, okay, we're going to start with the fact that you have PTSD.
Yep.
And I'm like, well, that's for soldiers.
Right.
Think about that.
Yes.
Growing up
such
in
a preconceived idea.
Yes. And now, of course, I have a completely different mindset, right? And I get it now. And anyway, so I've learned a lot more about myself and everything. So, but yes, so there's been a lot of trauma and grief are very different. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I mean, I think the trauma, like my sister walked in my mom's apartment.
Right.
So her level of trauma was totally different than my level of trauma of getting the phone call, which is also traumatic.
It is.
But it's different. You know? So, all right. So speak a little bit to some of the grief that you've walked through in life.
Yeah. I had the loss. I'm going to talk about it through loss, because I think that's a good lens to view grief.
I like it.
Is loss, different kinds of losses. I had the loss of innocence when my parents got divorced, because everything about my life shifted and changed from my perspective as a young child. I had the loss of purity when I experienced sexual assault as a teenager. I experienced the loss of relationships throughout college as I changed, as God redeemed different things in my life, and I chose to leave certain relationships behind. I experienced the loss of pregnancy. I have carried 5 children in my womb, and I only have 2 on the planet. So I have 3 with the Lord, and they were all early term miscarriages, but I will not say just, because they were not just early term miscarriages. They were babies, and they had heartbeats, and then they were gone. And so I have the loss of pregnancy. I have the loss of dreams, that every time I would find out I was pregnant, and I would imagine rocking that child. I would imagine what their name would be. I would imagine what our family would look like on the other side of their birth. I would imagine. And so I had to put to bed all of those dreams.
Each time,
distinctly and uniquely. I have experienced the loss of a career, like I was sharing earlier. I had dreamt of being an educator. I mean, I look back at journals from when I was a little kid, and that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a teacher. And I did, and I was a great teacher, and I loved my kids. And then I felt assigned to something different, and so I had to grieve that. So the loss of a career. I've had the loss of trusted leaders in my life, people that I allowed to have voice in my life who caused me great grief, people who I allowed to have an opinion about who I was and how I led, and they misled me and they misused my gifts, and that was a great loss for me in life. I have had the loss of near and dear friends through relational betrayal, where they took advantage of their position in my life. I've had the loss of people. My husband and I were married for 6 months whenever we lost his dad. And we barely knew how to be married, let alone how to be married and grieving, which I know you know all about that.
The first week of our marriage is when Justin lost his brother.
Yeah. And so that is an immense loss, and trying to navigate that is just, it feels impossible, but the Lord saw us through. And then in a time span of like 2 years, we lost 3 or 4 different people in Dusty's family. And so there's just been compounded loss over the years. And I would say one of the greatest things I've had to grieve is the loss of who I thought I would be at this point in my life.
Ooh, that's hard.
Yeah.
That's like hard for everyone listening to hear.
Yeah.
The loss of who I thought I should be.
Yeah.
At this point.
Well, I didn't say should.
I know you didn't, but that's what it was. Replace fill in the blank.
Sure.
Should be, because the loss of who you thought at some point earlier that you should be by now, or like you said, would be or could be.
Right.
And I think that is one of my core beliefs in life.
Yeah.
If there's anything people say, if you got one piece of advice to give a 20-year-old version of yourself, is there is no should.
Mm-hmm.
There is no one way of doing it.
Right.
There is no, like, this side of heaven, there is no destination for me.
Yeah.
So I'm not racing to anywhere this side of heaven.
Right.
So, like, you get married, you have a job, you buy a house, you buy a car, you do whatever it is, there is no path.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you get to pick it and determine it.
Yeah.
And so I think when I realized that was probably way later than I should have, could have,
right, right.
Realizing that there was no ultimate destination, that it's a journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's all a journey.
It is. And we can't be so focused on getting somewhere that we stop looking around at where we are and where we're headed, and the path that it's going to take to get there. And so I have experienced a lot of grief in my life. I've experienced a lot of different kinds of losses. I've had to recently, and if you listen to our podcast on motherhood, I said this about grieving my limits, like learning how to grieve that I have human limitation.
That's hard, though.
It is.
It's so hard.
But it allows me inside of community to have a greater dependence upon people who I trust and who I know love me. And it allows me to have a greater permission to trust in the Lord. And for me, that's everything. And so learning how to grieve my limits allows me to be better in every place that I show up, because I know what capacity I'm showing up with, and I'm content with who I am, and I'm content with who I'm not.
So let's talk about this grieving your limits, because this is not something that you see online. This is not something you see in Facebook memes all the time, but you've used that verbiage in our conversations before.
Yeah.
And so I'm Superwoman, in case anyone doesn't know. I wear a cape, most of the time. And so to tell me I have limits is like swallowing a shot of whiskey. I hate whiskey. It's like poison to I would think.
Yeah.
And so like it would just be like, oh, my whole face would be screwed up from like a really sour lemon. And like limits.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, limits. So like, how did you get to a place of first realizing you had limits that needed to be grieved?
Yeah. Well, earlier I was talking about my friend Jen, who I went to see in Fayetteville.
Yes.
And Jen is the person who taught me about grieving limits. And I think that I understood. I didn't have language for it until I met Jen, but I knew the problem existed in me. I just didn't know what to do with it. And so I am a 3 on the Enneagram. And so I'm a performer. You set a goal, I can achieve it. If you tell me to jump, I will ask you how high and how often. Like, I'm going to do above and beyond, right? That is how I'm wired. It is how I survived my childhood. That's how I survived and navigated my life as a young person. And so I learned early on, well, I would say in my early 20s, I began to understand that the demands of my environment, the demands of my circumstances were more than I could actually perform into. And I was met with illness, and I was met with actual things that made it hard to function in my everyday life. That's another form of grief for me, is that I've had multiple health diagnoses over the years. One that I'm in the middle of right now, navigating and trying to figure out my way through, and it's grief in my life. But I realized that I couldn't actually do everything in the course of a day that my mind could imagine. And so my body had a limit that my mind didn't like or understand. And my emotions had a limit that my therapist would push. And that I realized in therapy, wow, you're asking me to do things that I don't know that I want to do, that I don't really want to unearth or dig up. But okay, here I'm gonna trust you. I'm gonna do this. So a limitation. I began to feel resistance in my person. I've had resistance in my physical disposition. I had resistance in my emotional capabilities. And so I began to notice that there were places that I couldn't just push through anymore, that I had tried and I couldn't force myself to perform. I couldn't force myself to achieve. And I began to internalize that and ask myself the question of like, why? Like, what? Am I broken now? Like, has something messed up in me and now I'm broken? And because I can't perform all the same ways I used to, or I can't show up in all the same ways that I used to. And when Jen first told me, no, that's the grief of your limits. That's acknowledging that you have limits. At first, I was really mad. I was like, no, I do not have limits. Just like you, I'm a superhuman. I can do whatever needs to be done.
Yes.
I can do it for me. I can do it for you. I can do it for all of our kids. I can show up and be everything to everyone any time of day.
And you can't.
And
You
I
just
can't.
Yeah.
And so the language to understand that I needed to acknowledge that I had limits, and then I needed to grieve them, because really I was mad. I was mad that I couldn't show up in all the ways I wanted to. But that anger was coming from a real place of sadness, that I had expectation on myself that I needed to release and give myself permission to show up how I was. And so anger is a secondary emotion. And so I was showing up angry because I couldn't do all the things all the time for everyone. But that was coming from a place of grief, that I was having to acknowledge that I had limits. But I think that stems back to pride, because I think about the fall from Satan's fall from heaven, and that came from pride, because he wanted to be without limit, and God told him, no, you have limits. I'm the only one who doesn't. But then I also can't get too mad at myself, because I believe that it's built into us to want to be without limit, because God wired us for heaven, where he created and he exists outside of limitation. But my limits create in me a greater dependence on my God, my Jesus.
They do.
And so when I realize my weaknesses, my limitations, I'm more dependent upon his limitlessness. And so that's a whole different kind of grief that I've had to learn in just the last 3 years, how to navigate. But as I have learned how to navigate it, I am freer inside of my limits to accomplish more, to show up healthier, and freer to be myself, because I don't feel so confined to expectations, because I'm freer to just show up as I am.
But what I hear you saying, though, it seems very applicable to all areas of grief, though, is it first starts with acknowledging.
Yep.
You know, whatever that loss is. Like, I asked you to share a little bit about your grief, and I was thinking you were going to say like 2 or 3 things, and you just went off with like 15 things. But first of all, I mean, acknowledging the loss that we've all had in our lives.
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing, because as I sat there and listened to that list, I'm like, yeah. Oh yeah. And of course, anyone listening to this episode that's going to pull things up in their brain too. Like, I've been there, or I've been somewhere similar, or I didn't even realize that was grief.
Right.
Acknowledging it. And then the next thing that you said is giving yourself permission to show up for it.
Yeah.
And work through whatever that looks like. And yes,
Yeah.
it does look different if there's trauma. It may look different if a funeral's involved.
Sure.
It may look different if you're having to move across the country because now you have to get a different job, or whatever that is. But having that acknowledgement first of this is what I've been through. And for me and many people in my generation, which is like an overgeneralization, and I get it, is we were raised in it's going to be okay. Everything's fine. I'm okay mindset. So we don't naturally take the time to acknowledge those things and be ready to process them. At least I know for me, that was a huge deficit growing up in the generation that we are. I don't know, what are we, like millennials or what are we?
I think we're right on the
Millennial cuff, I think. Yeah, I think
we are.
Like the old millennials, maybe.
We're the like first generation millennials.
Yeah. Is that a thing? Like, I don't even know. I don't even know if that's a thing. So we've talked about grief and how it's shown up in your life. Yeah. And we've talked about verbiage. Man. Right? That's huge. To have the words to identify the loss and the lens through which you see the loss.
Yeah.
Because I think having that permission to say, this is a big deal for me.
Right.
Like, because I could lose a friendship with a person and you could lose a friendship with the same person and it feels different because our relationship with the person was different.
And because we're different. I'm a very big feeler.
And I'm not.
And so when I love big and deep and hard. And so when I have a loss, betrayal feels big and deep and hard because my investment feels really emotional.
And I feel like they never exist again and don't ever even think about them most of the time.
Yeah.
Except if we were really good friends, and then sometimes I still do. And I find myself, the struggle with loss of relationships to me is there's always these unanswered questions of why this, why that, why, or maybe what could I have done differently, or what could it, like my friend Brenda is, she's a avid podcast listener and super fan. So she's going to hear me talk about her, but we are also Marco Polo friends.
Oh, you and Brenda?
We Marco Polo every
Love
day,
it.
multiple times a day.
Is this Brenda from like childhood
Brenda Wells? Yeah, Amanda's mom.
We love you, Brenda.
We love you. So Brenda was telling me about, she's a big podcast listener in general. I don't know if it was a podcast or a Netflix series about Ghosted, is the name of it, and about how like these women are out dating people, right? And these men like propose is not the right word. They put up the perception. I'm not saying the right words here. Of this is my life, but then they're really not that person. And then once they get found out, then they ghost them and off they go. And then the women are like,
oh gosh,
oh my gosh, what happened? Was it me? Where did this guy go? He seemed great, all that. And so in that similar way, when relationships end abruptly, and sometimes there is not an opportunity to sit down and debrief together.
Right.
There is a break, whether it's a friendship or, a divorce or whatever. You don't have the opportunity to process those things. And I think those are the only things that I struggle with that seem to linger is over time, your mind, how those things pop up is so, I say random, but I don't ever really feel like things in life are random,
Right.
But it's like you're still processing, like, why did that end like that? Or what did I do? Or what did, and there's not a space to land to talk to that person about it, you know? So that part of grief is hard.
But I remember we were having a conversation one day about grief, about just different kinds of loss. And because when we hang out just for fun, we have deep conversations.
We do. It's so weird. Remember when Sandy, my mother-in-law, I have two mother-in-laws, but not two husbands. So there's that, Justin has a stepmom. And so Sandy was sitting on the couch one day. She was in town from Louisiana and we were having a conversation just like this podcast, like this deep.
So deep.
And she goes, man, I sit with my girlfriends and talk about what we're going to go eat and what that other lady was wearing at church last Sunday. And y'all been sitting here and dived into probably this conversation.
Yes, we do. We have these deep kinds of conversations all the time, which makes this really easy and fun.
It does.
By the way.
Yeah, it does.
But we were talking about it and you encouraged me and said, Dani, when those moments of remembrance creep in, like sit in it for a minute. And then say goodbye to it.
Good. Yeah, that's good. I need to remember that myself sometimes. Isn't that good? Yeah.
And so, like, the permission in a moment to go, oh, I really loved that person. And man, I really miss them. But that was for a season and a time, and now I can let it go.
Yeah, it's kind of like Marie Kondo. Do you know who that is? Like the organizing queen? And so she says that when you're decluttering your house, like if you have this shirt you love forever, but you never wear it anymore, like you look at it and you say like, thank you for serving me, but it's time to let you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's a great way to, and I feel like, depending on the situation, that could take longer, right? It could be indifferent.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure. But it's also the ability to accept the fact. And in Ecclesiastes in scripture, it talks about there's a season for all things. And in that scripture, it says everything is beautiful in its time, which is the idea that there's a beginning and an end. And so if we accept that inside of everything, we enter life as we grow, as we age and mature, and we think that this is like, these things last forever. Right? Like we're eternal beings. We have a present life on earth.
Stuck in a full body. Full?
Limited.
Limit full. I don't think it's a word. I made that up. A limited body.
But we want our circumstances to be eternal, and they're just not.
They're not, yeah.
And so if we can enter them and receive from them what's intended, whether it's a relationship, a career, a status, whatever, and say, okay, this is a gift for now, and it won't be a gift forever. And so I need to receive from it what it has. That old saying of this too shall pass. We love to attribute that to hard, grievous seasons.
But
that's also true of joyful seasons,
that
this too shall pass. And so to receive from it, whether it's grief or joy, which I feel like is a great segue for a question I have for you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Is celebration. So what does celebration for you look like inside of present suffering? And so I think about like with the loss of your mom, thinking about the first Christmas, the first Thanksgiving, thinking about your first birthday, her first birthday, the first year without her.
Mm-hmm.
What does celebration look like? Because I think that's a real practical thing that some people are curious about. Well, I've had this loss. What do I do now? How do I honor this person, whether if it's a death, if it's a relationship? How do we celebrate inside of suffering? So what's that look like for you?
So I'll tell you an example of how it doesn't look, and then I'll tell you how it looks for my mom. So when Justin and I got married in September of 21, we went to Greece. We got married in Santorini, blue rooftops, like dream.
So beautiful.
The dream wedding. I mean, really, dream.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were coming back home, and our friends were throwing us a reception the following Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Tanner died on Thursday.
Yeah.
And so we never had the wedding reception and still haven't.
Yeah.
So we didn't celebrate it.
Mm-hmm.
We just didn't. And it hasn't felt right yet.
Yeah.
Maybe our 5th anniversary, maybe our 3rd will have a wedding reception. I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah.
And so for that situation, we're just leaving it open-handed.
Yeah.
My dress is still hanging up in my sitting room.
Mm-hmm.
It's still not in a bag. I still see it every day. I yell at my dogs for laying on the train every day. It's still there.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think it's okay to just wait till it feels right.
Yeah.
In the instance of my mom, I don't know a person that I've met that's like, I'm over losing my mom now.
Come on.
Your mother is always your mother. Mm-hmm. Whether they raised you, like you said in our motherhood episode, there's only one biological mother to every human being. Right? And so you don't ever get over that.
Right.
The suffering never ends.
Yeah.
And Crew was about 2 or 3 years old, and I realized that he would never meet her.
Yeah.
And that was so hard.
The weight of that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Like he'll never know her.
Yeah.
But then it's my responsibility that he does know her.
Yeah.
And so we talk about her and we celebrate her.
Mm-hmm.
And yesterday we had a conversation and I said, yeah, well, my mommy taught me all kinds of good things when I was your age. And he's like what? When I was having lunch with him for his birthday.
Yeah.
And I said, she taught me that no matter what anybody wears, no matter if they smell or they're dirty or they have nice things or not, that I always be friends with them. And if they don't have things, I even try harder to be friends with them and make them feel included, because I might be the only person that's being nice to them that day.
That's right.
Yeah. And so I think that you find joy in, like I talked about this earlier in the episode, in what was, and cherishing, because in that same sense, I have a friend, Brittany Weber-Ziner, who's now Brittany Wood. Brittany was not raised by a biological parent at all. And so she was raised by a distant family member. And not long after mom died, it might have been the week of, she sent me a Facebook message, telling me that she cared about me. She loved me. And she said, but I remember growing up, I always wish I'd had a mom like yours.
Yeah.
And so that forever changed the lens that I looked at in my loss of my mother to how blessed I was to have had a mom for 29 years like that,
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it is mindset and reframing, and knowing that, and I know we're going to talk about this in the next episode too, tension.
Yeah.
But you can suffer and celebrate.
Yes, coexist.
You can do both.
Yeah.
And you don't have to feel guilty for either.
That's right.
I remember I could draw a picture of the day I genuinely laughed after my mom died.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling immense guilt because I was laughing. I mean, I just remember seeing myself and going, I'm laughing. What am I doing? My mom is dead. And having to learn that those things can both exist at the same time. So I think,
and we need them to.
We do. We do,
need them
because
to.
Suffering lasts much longer than we would like it to.
Right.
It does. Yeah. And if we're pushing it down, which I was really good at, then it's going to all bubble up at some point, right? Yeah.
I think about celebration in small moments. I think we talk about like celebrations, especially when someone has passed. We've experienced grief through death. We want to celebrate their birthday, or we want to celebrate on our children's birthday and talk about them, or on our birthdays, or on the first Christmas, first Thanksgiving. I celebrate your mom every time. So like we pull out decorations for any holiday. I for some reason almost always have a Beanie Baby that goes along with the holiday, right?
And that's
like
what she loved.
And she loved Beanie Babies.
She did.
So
She
I
loved
think
them.
about Gracie every time I put those out or put them in the girls' room.
Yes.
I celebrate your mom every time that I open a soda can and I put a straw in it. Because she always turned the tab around
the other way,
and then put a straw through the hole.
Because it keeps the straw from coming out of the carbonation.
Yes. And
Sure
so
does.
like little things. And so for someone who's listening who grief feels so present and near, I would encourage you to find little opportunities to celebrate. I celebrate the grief, the loss of my career every time I show up in my child's classroom at her school to read to those kids or to have an activity or a craft with those kids. I celebrate that I once was a really great teacher, and now there are chances to do that again and again and again. And so every chance we get to celebrate something that once caused us deep grief is a way to like shake a defiant fist at
And
suffering
it's like a little
and celebrate
bit of,
well.
dose of healing.
Yeah, it is.
It's like a little healing dose.
It
Like you just
is.
pour just a little bit of healing on that every single time,
Yes.
you know? And I don't think that it ever is like, it becomes a scar.
Mm-hmm.
Does it become invisible?
Right.
But I think that those scars can be battle wounds in that I didn't die. I made it through, you know? And I always
Well,
say,
a scar has a purpose.
Right.
I have a giant scar on my arm where I had a tumor removed. That scar is a reminder that had a purpose to remove a sickness from my body.
Yes.
And that scar, it isn't a wound anymore. I don't have to tend to it. I don't have to treat it. I don't have to look after it. But it's there to remind me. And our emotional scars are just that. Once we take care of them past the point of being wounds. And there's a preparation that's required of a wound care, right? We think about that instead of surgery or accidents to our physical bodies, but we have to do wound care for our own souls so that those things that wound us can one day be what are helping us experience the world better because they're simply scars and not wounds anymore.
they are, yeah. I always tell people, and we'll close with this on this episode. Wait, did we do trivia in the trenches?
No, we've just been having all this
All right, so I'm
conversation.
going to say what I was going to say so I don't forget, and then we'll do
Okay.
trivia in the trenches. And
Okay.
we'll just end this episode with trivia. So
Okay.
we'll end it on like a light note.
Like a cliffhanger.
Yes.
For the next
that's
one.
it. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. So,
Like it.
but I always tell people in really hard seasons, and I tell myself this too, this is like a dose of regular, is you have a 100% success rate of getting through tough shit.
You still, because you're still here.
You're still here. You're alive. You're breathing. We're having this conversation.
Yes.
You have made it through tough days, tough
Yes.
situations, tough relationships, tough
Yes.
whatever. Like, you're already winning.
Right.
So now let's figure out how to get through this one.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, all right. Trivia in the trenches.
Oh, that was you.
Oh, is it me? Oh,
was
it is me. Oh, it is. No,
It
it's
is
me.
you. Okay.
It's me. It's
Oh,
me.
good.
It's gross.
Oh.
I know, right? I don't know why I
Trivia
put this-
always makes me nervous.
All
with
right, you ready? Here it is. Let's
Yes,
trivia in the
I'm
trenches.
ready.
All right. What liquid did
Oh,
ancient
gosh.
What liquid did ancient Romans use to whiten their teeth? This has nothing to do with this episode. So,
Oh, I was thinking like embalming something because you said Egyptians and we've been talking about death. So I was thinking,
urine.
what?
Ancient Romans used human and animal urine.
To whiten their teeth?
Yeah, but here's my question. Google this, listeners. Did it work?
Are you going to try it?
No, I'm not going to try
Then
it.
why do you want to know if it works?
I don't know, because like, was it fruitful or was it just a waste of time? Like an old wives' tale they believed from the old
Here's what
wives
I
before the
wonder
Romans. I
is
don't know who the
what
Greeks.
man decided that was a good idea.
To slosh your pee-pee around in your mouth.
You know, it wasn't a woman who came
No.
up with that.
We'll close with that. I love that. All right, until next time. Thanks for listening to The Grit Crusade. I'm Brooke Plack. Join me again next week on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. This podcast is produced by ClintonCreative.com.